General Robert E. Lee led the Confederate forces during America's deadliest and most divisive war. Despite numerous victories on the battlefield, he ultimately bowed to overwhelming odds.
Robert E. Lee was one of the greatest generals in world history. He ranks with Alexander, Hannibal, Napoleon, Frederick the Great. He did, in fact, in many instances, more with less than all of those people did.
Robert E. Lee was born in Virginia on January 19, 1807, to an aristocratic Virginia family. He graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and married Mary Custis, the great-granddaughter of Martha Washington.
Once the Mexican War began, he was assigned to Winfield Scott's staff and served with great distinction there.
As a result of his exploits during the Mexican War, Lee was considered one of the most courageous, intelligent, and daring officers in the Army at the time.
After the war, Lee served as superintendent of West Point until 1855, when he left to take a cavalry position in Texas. In 1859, he was ordered to put down John Brown's slave rebellion at Harper's Ferry, which he executed in 1 hour.
At the beginning of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln asked Robert E. Lee to lead the Union forces. Robert E. Lee thought of himself first as a Virginian. He refused to do so and in fact resigned his post.
He would not take up arms against his fellow Southerners, even though he adamantly opposed secession and he viewed slavery as an evil.
He did not fight for the South until his home state of Virginia was invaded.
Lee distinguished himself on the battlefield and took command of the force he named the Army of Northern Virginia in 1862.
Robert E. Lee was able to defeat George McClellan outside of Richmond in the 7 Days Battle, forcing the withdrawal of the Union Army from its positions just outside of Richmond.
In the Second Battle of Manassas in 1862 and the Battle of Chancellorsville in 1863, he was dramatically outnumbered, but he was able to outmaneuver and surprise his enemy and defeat substantially larger forces.
With the Battle of Antietam and then Gettysburg in July 1863, however, the tide turned against the Confederate forces.
The fact that the war lasted as long as it did certainly is a testament to Lee's abilities as a general, given the overwhelming numbers and material that he faced coming out of the North.
By 1865, with odds too great and supplies too low, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Virginia on April 9, 1865.
After he surrenders to Grant, he instructs his men to simply go home, not to fight a guerrilla war. He says, if you make as good citizens as you have made soldiers, then I'll have done my job.
Lee eventually became the president of Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, which is today Washington and Lee University. During this period of time, he did everything he could to create reconciliation between the North and South.
While still president of the college, Robert E. Lee died on October 12, 1870, in Lexington, Virginia.
Robert E. Lee today is remembered in the South as a hero, in the North perhaps as a traitor. He was a man of principle who fought for a cause he believed in.
I'm Ulysses S. Grant. I was born in Point Pleasant, Ohio in 1822. At age 17, my father secured for me an appointment to the United States Military Academy. I said, I won't go. He said, I think you will. And I said, well, if you think I will, then I think I will. When I got to the academy, I was 17 years old. I was 5 feet tall and I weighed 105 pounds. I had found out that everyone at West Point gets a nickname. With the name like Hiram Ulysses Grant and those initials, I could only imagine what my nickname would be. However, the man who appointed me to the academy did not know my full name. He thought my middle name was my mother's maiden name of Simpson. So he put down Ulysses Simpson Grant, and I became Ulysses Simpson Grant. I had no idea what significance those letters, initials, would be 19 years later at the Battle of Fort Donelson. But I became Sam Grant as my nickname. After graduating from West Point, left and went to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, met Julia Dent, a roommate of mine, Fred Dent, was his sister. So we became engaged. The Mexican War came along. I went to Mexico. I was brevetted 3 times for bravery, even though I was in the Quartermaster Corps. I didn't have a combat assignment, but I went to the sound of the guns. I wrote Julia a letter and said, it seems to me that the sound or the fear of the bullets and missiles is worse than the actual sound. And I've got a reputation for being uncannily calm under fire. After the war, I came back and I married Julia. We had 4 children. In 1854, I resigned from the Army as a full captain, one of only 50 in the United States Army at that time. For the next several years, while I was not successful at anything, I really wasn't a failure. Then the war started. I was appointed Colonel of the 21st Illinois. In July of 1861, we moved out of Springfield, Illinois. I was appointed Brigadier General in August. After the Battle of Fort Donelson in February of '62, the first major Union victory, I was appointed Major General. Then I went on to Shiloh in April after Fort Donelson. Then we moved into Vicksburg and took Vicksburg in July of '63. Then in the fall of '63, I went to Chattanooga. Then President Lincoln put through an act of Congress and revived the rank of Lieutenant General and gave me my 3rd star. At the end of the war, I became Secretary of War, and the Republican Party approached me and asked me to run for president. I felt that I should, since they were the party that supported President Lincoln and myself. I served in 2 terms, being elected both times by some of the largest majorities of any American president. I died in 1885 of inoperable throat cancer after having finished just 5 days before my death my memoirs, which became the first American bestseller on pre-publication subscriptions. Julia made about $450,000, and her future and security were secured.
On Palm Sunday, April 9, 1865, after 4 long years of fighting, the Civil War was finally drawing to an end. For the last 10 months, Petersburg, Virginia had remained the keystone of Southern hope. Its railways were arteries supplying the Confederacy, and on April 1, 1865, the Union Army smashed through the Confederate lines from Richmond to Petersburg. The Southern Confederate forces, led by General Robert E. Lee, retreated to the south. The Northern Union forces, led by General Ulysses S. Grant, moved quickly, blocking Lee's troops. Lee, redirecting his forces, moved westward, but lost hundreds of his men from fatigue and starvation, something that proved to be more deadly than cannon fire and bullets. On April 8th, the 7th day of Lee's retreat, he made camp in a wooded grove near the small village of Appomattox Courthouse. By 9 p.m. of that evening, cannon fire from the Union forces could be heard echoing across the fields, announcing to the Confederacy that they were surrounded by Union forces. At morning's light, Lee's Confederate troops gathered at the fields and advanced towards Appomattox Courthouse. The Confederate soldiers valiantly fought, pushing their way until finally the front lines of the Union troops gave way. The cries of victory from the Southern troops soon filled the air. But no sooner had those cheers died down when across the horizons of the field came a line of blue Union infantry, thundering down upon the Confederate soldiers in numbers too great to be challenged. The Union men were soon upon the Confederate troops, and they were trapped. There was no way out, and it was their place to hold the lines with their own blood. Confederate General Robert E. Lee, realizing the hopelessness of the situation, sent a dispatch to Union General Ulysses S. Grant asking to meet and discuss the terms for surrender and the end of the Civil War. By noon, in the small village of Appomattox Courthouse, a building was sought to be used for their meeting place. The home of Wilmer McLean, a merchant and a Confederate veteran of the 1861 Manassas campaign, was chosen to be the place where the Confederate and Union commanders would meet. General Robert E. Lee arrived first at McLean's house with only one aide at his side. He sat exhausted and silent in McLean's parlor at a marble-topped table. 30 minutes later, General Ulysses S. Grant arrived with his staff. Grant greeted Lee with a handshake and casual conversation. General Lee pressed forward and asked General Grant to write down the terms of surrender for the Confederate Army that would end this terrible war. Seating himself at an opposite table, General Grant took pen in hand and wrote out the Union Army's well-rehearsed terms of agreement. The agreement allowed the Confederate troops to be paroled and turning in their weapons to the U.S. government, and individuals owning their own horses were allowed to keep them as they would be returning home in time for spring planting. News of the surrender at Appomattox Courthouse, April 9, 1865, spread rapidly as soldiers of both sides wept with exhaustion and were grateful to be alive. Relief was universal as the tension and constant fear of death released its icy grip from the shoulders of both the Union and Confederate armies.